The Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Today, friends, we have another exciting guest on the podcast. This is a guest who is doing something that is different than any other guest we've had on this podcast so far, and we've been doing this podcast since 2021. We love to find the different aspects of alternative parties and different things people do in this space. And his name is John Davis, and he is going to talk to us about collecting political items. So welcome to the podcast, John.
Glad to be here.
John, if we could start by you kindly giving us an introduction to yourself, a brief biographical sketch.
Okay, I started collecting political items as a teenager when I saw that you can get buttons free at the party headquarters. I used to collect stamps and coins, but then you'd have to buy them. But these collectibles were free, so that was a lot of fun to go to the headquarters and get free buttons and then trade them to other people around the country and get other buttons. So that's how I got started as a teenager. And then I found out you could make your own buttons, find interesting causes, and make buttons, and other people would buy them or trade you other buttons for them. So I started making buttons, and I even made some for a couple parties, like the Prohibition Party. I made their official button a couple years, and the United States Pacifist Party, I made his buttons one year, I think in the year 2000. And it's been a lot of fun making and trading and buying and selling these political items. They're so historical. You know, these are things that are in the Smithsonian Institution to show what our campaigns were like through history.
Wow. Guess what? I knew Bradford Little of the Pacifist Party. It's been a long time, been about 20 years. When I was in college, we had conferences that this organization ran, and we invited him. He came a couple times, all the way from Chicago. He drove on the Greyhound. He took the Greyhound. So I'm familiar with him. So that's awesome that you did that for him.
Oh yeah, that's awesome.
Yes, yeah. And the Prohibition Party we've interviewed on this podcast too, and they're very interesting as well.
Which candidates did you interview from the Prohibition Party?
We interviewed James Hedges, Phil Collins, I believe it was Jonathan Mackey, and then there was somebody else we interviewed. So we interviewed four people from...
James Hedges I was dealing with for a long time. He's the one who ordered the buttons from me. He's a really nice guy, and we worked together to design the right button. And one year when they didn't do a button, they usually did one every year, but they didn't, I think, in 2012. And then I was making buttons every year for every party, and he pictured mine in the Prohibition newsletter so people could order mine even though the party didn't have its own official button.
Oh, that's good. That's neat. So what have producing the items and collecting these items, what have they taught you about alternative parties?
Well, all the different causes, all the variety of issues that there is out there that aren't being covered by the main parties. It's interesting. There was one, I think in 2008, I made 50 or 52 different buttons because there were 50 or 52 different parties on the ballot in either one state or the other. Some of them, like the Prohibition Party, was usually on 20 or 30 state ballots, but a lot of these parties were only on one state ballot.
Oh.
But in 2008, there were over 50 different parties throughout the country.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's awesome. You did those all.
Yeah, I did one for each party. And one thing in the button collecting hobby, there's a word called Jugate, Jugate, and that's a button that pictures two people, president and vice president. And those are the most desirable ones. Someone would rather have a button with the picture of both candidates than just the names of the candidates.
Okay.
So I always tried to make Jugates for all the parties, and I did almost all of them in 2008 with Jugates, but some of them didn't have a running mate, or I couldn't find the picture of the vice president, so some had one picture, or like I put the party symbol next to the presidential candidate if there was no photo available.
Oh, that sounds good. So has the interest in buttons decreased over time with all the digitalization of things these days, or has interest stayed constant?
Well, the parties seem not as interested in buttons as they used to be. They'd rather pay for television and radio and internet commercials, or some want to save money and just make stickers you can stick on your jacket. They don't want to pay for a metal button. So the parties don't seem to have been making many buttons, but private companies have.
Oh, okay.
And there's really thousands. If you go on Facebook, there's a political memorabilia exchange, PME, with really hundreds or thousands of buttons.
Okay. So the buttons that are produced are people who are interested in politics who may not be involved in the parties directly want to buy them for collection. Is that correct?
Right. People make them people like me, one person company makes buttons and hopes that a party will buy them, or supporters will buy them, or collectors will buy them. In the collecting hobby, people kind of look down on buttons that are only made for other collectors.
Oh, okay.
They like them that if they were, if you make a button and you sell some to a group or a party and it's really used, like in a rally, that seems more authentic than one you make just to sell to other collectors.
Okay, sure. So what would you say is your favorite item amongst the buttons you've collected and or the ones you produced?
Well, it's not one item, but at the moment I had a large collection, like with a whole tray for every presidential candidate since the 1800s.
Wow.
But then my best button, it was a John Davis Juget from 1924, and it cost $5,000. And one day I was holding it, admiring it, and as my warm hand was on this cold surface of the button, because I brought it in from the car because I was showing it in a TV interview, a crack developed across the surface. And suddenly this $5,000 button was worth maybe $2,000 because it had a crack. So I kind of got nervous, and I sold almost all of my collection. But the favorite ones that I'm keeping are one button from every party for every election.
Okay.
Like in 1932, I have, I think, like 6 different. There were the Socialist Party and the Farmer Labor Party and a few of those, plus the Democrats and Republicans. And as I said, in 2008, I have 50 different parties. And in 1984, I just got one this week. I won it on eBay, a missing button from 1984. And I think I have 12 or 15 different parties from 1984.
Oh, wow.
And that's my favorite, is to have a collection, to try to get one from every party for every election.
Okay, cool. So since you had that unfortunate incident, how do you preserve the buttons? How do you protect them for posterity?
I keep them indoors in a climate-controlled house. I'm in Florida, so it's humid out there, so air conditioning keeps it climate-controlled, and I don't bring them out in the sunlight, and I don't touch them anymore.
Oh, okay.
And I don't have any that are worth that much anymore. I try to keep just the less expensive ones. I don't want to risk that again.
Okay.
But there's buttons that go for $50 or $100, or one went for $185,000. So there's people that pay that kind of money for buttons. I think the most expensive third-party button is about $10,000, if I remember correctly, and that's a Thurmond Wright, when Strom Thurmond was running on the States' Rights Party in 1948.
Oh, yuck.
And Truman and Dewey. And a Juget for him is around, I think, 8,000 or 10,000, maybe even 20 at one time.
Wow.
But that's the most expensive third-party button that I can remember.
Interesting. So what's the most expensive two-party button?
You mean main party button? Or
Yeah.
That's it's called the Holy Grail of button collecting. Is in 1920, James Cox was running for president with a young Franklin Roosevelt as his vice presidential candidate, running against Harding and Coolidge. And they lost. And there were only a few Juguts made with picturing Cox and Franklin Roosevelt. And there's maybe like 5 or 7 designs, and maybe only 40 altogether of all those designs. And those range from like maybe 5,000 or 7,000 for a cracked or spotted one, ranging to one sold, I think last year, a large, perfect one sold for $185,000.
Wow. Wow, interesting. So we talked about some of your older buttons. Did you already tell me which one was your oldest? Did you say that was one from 1820 was your oldest? Did I hear right or not?
Well, in those days it wasn't buttons. I once had a couple George Washington. They weren't campaign buttons. They were inauguration buttons. And,
oh, okay.
And people wore them on their coats. They're like 1 1/4 brass coat buttons, and they had like GW on them for George Washington or Eagle and Long Live the President. And those go for like 2,000 to 4,000 or even more for the shiny ones, maybe 10 or 20,000. And I had a couple of those once, but I sold them to concentrate on having one from each party. Those weren't really campaign.
Oh, sure.
So, and they didn't have buttons until the campaign button, the celluloid button we know today, was invented in 1896 or 1894, and it was first used in 1896.
Okay.
And earlier they used like tokens or medals, like a medal with like Andrew Jackson's picture on it hanging from a little eagle pin, and people would wear those. So my early stuff, starting with like 1828, excuse me, is some tokens for each candidate, and then they're kind of like hard to read and dark and boring. So to make it interesting for those early days, I also collect a ballot for each candidate.
Oh, okay.
And that's more, visible and more readable. And those were ballots that people put into the ballot box. They were like some were just printed and handed out to the party members, and some were even printed in the newspaper. So if somebody, couldn't spell good all the people on the ticket, they would just cut the ballot out of the newspaper and put it in the ballot box on election day.
Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry, go ahead.
You've heard of that, huh?
Yeah, I've heard of that.
So I have like from 1828, 1832, 1836, I have ballots, usually the ones cut out of newspapers since they're cheaper to buy than the printed ones. And so I have like a token or medal for each candidate, and then the ballot underneath it to show the candidates' names. It usually says who the president and vice president candidates are, and then the electors for the Electoral College, and then sometimes the governor or whoever else was running at the time. Okay.
So are you aware of the date that they transitioned over the standard ballot that we know today?
Was it Andrew Jackson's election, or do you mean another time?
I remember learning about that in history where you could put ballots of any size in the ballot box, and nowadays that would be too much of a hassle. It would overwhelm the system. So I'm wondering, when was the date when they had the standard ballot that everyone has to fill out the same ballot and they're printed by the government?
I'm not really sure about that. That's an interesting point I hadn't thought about.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's also interesting. You were talking about the technology developed in 1896. So the buttons before that were metals, or they were different than the buttons we know today, as you said. So when you make the buttons, what type of technology do you use to make them?
Well, I can just print them on my color laser printer, or before it was my color inkjet printer.
Okay.
And some people use a piece of Mylar and put the paper on the shell and then the Mylar on top and then crimp it. But I found that a lot of times what happens is after a few years, the metal under there rusts if you don't use a really expensive metal, which nobody does, and it starts spotting. A spotted button is called foxed. A foxed button is where there's like brown rust spots coming through from the metal under the paper. So what I started doing very early on was laminate the paper. So I have a heat laminating machine, and I take the button paper that I printed and put it through the lamination process on both sides, and then cut it out and crimp it into a button.
Okay. So there's a machine that is like a press, right? That once you laminate it, you put it onto that press, and then it punches out the button?
Well, first I have to cut the button out with a circle cutter, and then I put a shell into the press and put the laminated circle on top, and press it into the top of the press, and then put the bottom piece of the button below it and press it together into a crimped button.
Okay. So
kind
where
of a
does
slow process? It's a hand process. You have to push down once for the top piece, and then push down a second time for the bottom piece. And like with a 6-inch button, it's a real pressure to crimp that big 6-inch metal shell.
Okay, so it's a painstaking, custom-made process.
Yes.
Okay. So where does one get a machine to make a button like that?
There's button companies, like I think Badge Parts Inc. in Wisconsin is where I got mine.
Okay.
There's a number of companies throughout the country that sell button-making machines.
Okay. So those aren't too hard to find then.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked earlier about the Prohibition Party, and you mentioned you have some of their buttons. One party that interests me is one of the most successful alternative parties, and also one of the most obscure, not too many people know about, the Anti-Masonic Party. So have you any button or memorabilia from them?
I don't, because I don't think they were ever on the ballot anywhere, were they? I mean, I've heard of it, but I've never seen any items for them. Did they support another candidate or something?
No, they weren't around for very long. They went into the Whig Party, as I recall.
Okay.
So they were around for maybe about 12 years, but they did win some seats in some representative positions, and they had, I believe Millard Fillmore was one of them before he switched over to the Whigs. So it was more of a temporary thing, as that idea is not something that would probably be popular anymore. That type of intense aversion to Freemasonry. From what I gather these days, people don't care so much about the Masons like they did back then. So it wouldn't catch that much popularity.
Yeah, it sounds like they had more local candidates, and I only collect presidential, so maybe they never got up to that level of having a presidential candidate.
Yeah, that may have been the case. Okay, that makes sense then. So that is your focus. Your focus is on presidential.
Yes, there's just too many other offices. There's already enough presidential with sometimes 50 parties. So, going for governors and congressmen and senators is just more than I can imagine covering.
Oh, sure. So where do you find out which candidates are running? Because you seem like you get them all. So obviously the big ones that everybody knows, but there's other ones that are harder to find out. So where do you get your sources for that information, if I may ask?
There's some websites that list them. I think the one I remember the most is politics1.com.
Yeah.
And I guess he even has a picture of every president and vice presidential candidate running. So that's helpful. If I can't find a photo of some candidate, he's always got them there.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's cool. So since you collect buttons, are you a collector by nature, or is this your sole activity that you collect for?
It's kind of an obsession, actually. I have probably 200,000 buttons. Maybe.
Wow.
My sister calls me a hoarder, but it's not all over my house. I have an office that since I'm retired, my office is empty, and now it's full of buttons, or it was empty. So
okay.
I just the other day I counted, and I have 2,500 drawers or shelves or baskets or bins of buttons. And right now, my life goal is to sell as much as possible so that I don't leave a lot for my wife and children to have to deal with someday.
Oh, that's considerate. So it sounds like your political items aren't all over the house like a true hoarder would be. They're limited to certain areas of your house.
Yes. They were
okay.
They were in I used to have a full room at one of the bedrooms, and then we had another child, and my wife made me clean out the room for him, and I brought them to the extra room at my office. And but I do have a hurricane room, which when we built our house, I made sure it was solid concrete walls with a solid concrete ceiling and a solid metal door, so that if ever there was a hurricane here in Florida on my house, my collection would be safe.
Oh, wow.
So at my house, that's the only place they are now. But at my office, I have, I think, 3 rooms with the bins and shelves and ring binders. I probably have 150 ring binders by candidate listed, one for each candidate.
Okay.
And people can come by my place and buy stuff. It's all for sale.
Oh, so your home is open to the public?
No, my office.
Your office, okay.
I said I brought everything to my office, and it's open. I'm not here all the time, so I ask people to call in advance, and people come by, and usually they run out of money and have to go to the ATM because they found so much they didn't expect to be spending so much.
Oh, wow. Okay.
As I said, there's probably 200,000 items altogether.
Okay. So is your office I'm sorry if I missed when you said that, is your office in the middle of is it in the middle of the city, or is it in the outskirts area? So trying to picture where your office would be for people to get to.
It's in Lake Wales, Florida, and it's right downtown.
Okay.
28 West Park Avenue, and it's, one business I'm still continuing is my publishing company, Galt Press.
Oh.
And I published a book, 200 Years of Political Campaign Collectibles, and it shows color pictures of items from every candidate, from George Washington through, it was 2004 was when I published it.
Oh, interesting.
So it's galtpress.com, GALTPRESS.com.
Like John Galt?
Yes. How did you know?
Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
I have some Who is John Galt buttons, too.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good conversation.
Yeah,
topic.
that's a whole nother conversation.
So you have a publishing company in addition to this business. That's good. More than one thing you're doing.
Yeah, the button books were kind of to interest people in the buttons for the buttons I'm selling.
Oh, okay. So the two businesses work hand in hand.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So since you've collected buttons and you're producing buttons, have you gotten involved in politics directly, or is that something you feel you're better as a detached observer in your field?
No, I haven't really been involved. I've I don't really know anywhere nearby here in Lake Wales that one could get involved, but I've been more involved with making the items and doing that part of it.
Okay, so that's your role, that's your place in the movement, is to make these buttons that people can have nostalgia and also as an appreciation of the culture.
Yeah, between 2016 and 2020, I was making buttons for a friend who was selling them on eBay.
Oh.
And sometimes I would design like 50 or 100 a week. Like on a Thursday night, I was still working then. On Thursday night, I'd have a few beers and sit down at the computer and usually making some funny memes into buttons.
Oh.
And I'd send them to him, and he would sell them on eBay. As I said, it was like sometimes 50 or 100 different designs a week regarding Trump or something going on. Like with Kim, remember when Trump visited North Korea, and there were all kinds of cartoons and funny things about that. And he put them on eBay, and sometimes people would bid like $20 or $30 or sometimes even $50 or $80, for just one little button design I made that week.
Wow.
So that was fun, and it was, feeding this need of people to have collectibles about the current historical situation.
Oh, sure. So, in addition to selling the buttons, do you ever trade buttons with people?
Yeah, when somebody doesn't have the money or want to spend, then we trade buttons. I just traded with someone the other day. One field of buttons is deadheads. Like the first one was in 1988. Someone made a deadheads for Dukakis. And after that, I got inspired. In 1996, I made a deadheads for Clinton Gore.
Oh, wow.
And it was put on a political auction, and someone bid $300 for it. And it was just, one button I made on my press here real easily. And then the auctioneer called me and said, "Have you got another one?" The underbidder would pay $270 for it. So I sold two of those buttons for $570, just, button I put together. So over the years, just about every election, I made deadhead buttons. And the other day, a friend who makes deadhead buttons, too, we each sent each other a package of this year's deadheads for Trump, deadheads for Harris.
Oh,
so
my.
we could each have each other's in our collection. I think I have maybe 10 trays. The trays are usually 12 by 16 inches. I think my deadheads collection is 10 or 11 trays. The most were for Obama. There were a lot I got on eBay during the Obama years, deadheads for Obama. But
wow.
there have been deadheads for everybody. Deadheads for Dean when he was running, and Kerry, and Hillary, and even like Trump and Romney, there's deadheads for them. So that's a fun collection. They're not expensive, and they're fun to find. And I could trade with other collectors and not have to pay for them.
Oh, sure. Sure. So, have you noticed demographics of the people who buy buttons? Is there any demographic characteristics, or is there a broad spectrum of people who buy them?
No, actually, just like other collectibles, like stamps or coins or baseball cards, they're mostly old men.
Oh, okay.
When you go to a button show, everybody's got white hair or white beards, but there's a small but sure number of young collectors coming in 20s and 30s, and they're having a good time because as the old collectors are retiring or dying off, their extensive collections are coming up for sale.
Oh, yeah.
And in fact, a lot of the older, expensive ones are now coming down in price because there's less collectors and more people retiring. So, like today, you could get some real bargains compared to 20 years ago or 30 years ago. There's, buttons that were $1,000 might be $200 now.
Wow.
Because there are more of them available and less people fighting over them.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So it's a good time for someone interested in this kind of thing for politics to, get some really great items from the older days. Like the 1890, when the button was invented in 1896 through about 1920, is called the golden age of buttons because they made so many different beautiful designs. And like in 1896 and 1900, the issue was free silver. Bryan wanted people to be able to make their own coins out of silver at a ratio of 16 to 1. So a lot of those buttons, beautiful buttons from 1896 and 1900, were made with gold and silver ink.
Wow.
And they're really beautiful. And a lot of them had the slogan 16 to 1. Like there's like a clock design where the time on the clock is 16 minutes to 1, which is a cute thing for the 16 to 1 ratio of gold versus silver.
Interesting. So, John, how can our audience support your button making business?
They can email galtpress@warda.net, GALTPRESS @WARDA.net, and I could give them information on different buttons.
Okay.
Or also on Facebook, John Davis on Facebook. That's where I list stuff for sale.
And that's how I found you, right?
Yep. I guess you found me as the moderator of the third party button collectors. Is that it?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they could go to the third party button collectors group because there's probably 100 John Davises out there.
Oh,
so
yeah.
They could go to the third party collectors group and join, and then my name would be there, and you'll know which John Davis you're looking for.
Sounds good. How about if they want to read your books from Galt Press? We're at same email address?
Yes, or they're for sale on the Political Memorabilia Exchange. Yeah,
Okay.
I can send a link if they send an email to galtpress@warda.net. I can send a link to the. I'm having a sale on it. I did 100 years of political campaign collectibles originally in 1996. So I'm giving that book away free if people buy the new book, the 2004 book, at 30% off. So it's a special deal on Political Memorabilia Exchange, and I would send that link if somebody emails me.
Okay.
Or send a PM. Go to the third-party page and send the PM to me.
Okay, private message.
On Facebook. Yeah,
okay.
Private message on Facebook.
Okay, so did you say the email address is galtpress@LUADA?
No, galtpress@warda, WARDA.net.
Warda, okay, got it.
galtpress@warda.net.
Okay, perfect. John, we learned a lot of things today, and we had a lot of interesting facts to share with us, so we appreciate you coming on the podcast today.
Okay, I enjoyed it, and I'm glad you liked it.
All right, take care and all the best with your political button business as well as everything else you do in your life.
Okay, same to you. Thank you. Bye.
All right.